Hello, my name is Richard Parker. I'm here to talk about the history of Mount Dinham and St. Michael's Church in Exeter. This lecture was originally written as a St. Michael's Heritage Lecture and was first given in June 2014, but it's been augmented for your listening pleasure. Mount Dinham is an extraordinary place. It's a Victorian charitable village set on a sort of triangular promontory to the northwest of the ancient city of Exeter. Now, although most of what you see today on Mount Dinham is Victorian, the site in fact has a much more ancient history, which has only become apparent in recent years due to archaeological excavations by Exeter Archaeology during the conversion of some of the school buildings on the site to housing. As many will know, Exeter was founded as a military fortress in the early Roman military period, in around about 50 AD. It seems likely that Mount Dinham contained a small fort, which may have predated the military fortress in Exeter itself, because some of the finds at Mount Dinham were so remarkable. They seem to suggest that the original establishment was at Mount Dinham and was later shifted to Exeter when that much larger fortress was complete. So the first slide shows the possible military compounds found outside Exeter. Two of the most recent discoveries in red, and the early ones that are known about in blue. A third fortification has now been discovered under the bus station in St. Sidwell's. So a place of great interest for the enthusiasts for Roman archaeology. On Mount Dinham, another remarkable feature was the extraordinary timber building that was found to the rear of the Episcopal school building. This was a massive structure with a central aisle with colossal wooden pillars on both sides, which seem to have supported a raised structure, probably glazed, and with wider aisles to either side. This building was huge. It was more or less on the scale of the present St. Michael's Church, and it must have looked a very impressive sight on the cliffs above Mount Dinham. This building doesn't seem to have lasted very long, but it was part of a much larger complex, including sort of fortified ditches and other structures that haven't quite been understood yet. It is possible that the timber building was dismantled after a very short time and re-erected within the present city walls. After the removal of the building, the site appears to have been used as a Roman cemetery, and this is of course very important for the future. Now, the finds from the Roman cemetery, also the military period, round about 70 AD, include wonderful grave goods like a Samian-ware dish, which is a red clay dish, often with embossed decoration, and a glass unguent flask. There were also a hoard of 22 Roman coins, which can, I believe, now be inspected at Exeter Museum. So this illustration of the Roman civil period town in around 300 AD, drawn by Eric Haddon of Exeter Archaeology back in the 1970s, now has to be augmented by the addition of extra fortified structures and cemeteries. So you can see in this drawing at the top left-hand corner the shape of Mount Dinham on its triangular promontory surrounded by cliffs, a fortified site that it's unlikely that the Romans or anybody else would not have utilised. It is thus rather a surprise to find that after the Romans left, nothing much appears to be done with Mount Dinham for many centuries. The Victorian writer in 1877 who referred to it, saying, "In referring to the beautiful situation of the free cottage grounds, the wonder is now expressed that so fine a site should have been so long occupied merely as a garden." He was making the sensible point that such a high up, healthy and well fortified site should really have been utilised for some useful purpose. if not as the site of a magnificent church. Medieval Exeter was, of course, largely contained within the Roman walls, which were erected around 200 AD. These were defended on one side by the Longbrook Valley, which now contains X Street, and on the other by the Shipbrook Valley, which is sort of runs underneath St Leonard's Church. To the east of the city, St Sidwell's was an ancient Roman burial ground like St David's, and both St Sidwell and St David probably had early churches that may have developed as a result of this association with Roman burial sites. However, this is very unclear. It's much more likely in the context of St Sidwell's. However, St David's, with an early sounding dedication, may be similar. Both churches, however, belonged to Hevertree parish. They were probably given it at some point, given to the church at some point, but it's uncertain when. Much of the parish of St David consisted of a vast and ancient estate, largely wooded, which belonged to the city chamber and was called the Duryard Estate, meaning the deer park. So the city often used it for sourcing timber and other materials during the Middle Ages. So Hevertree parish almost completely surrounded the walled city, although parts of it obviously were dedicated to the chapelries of St David and St Sidwell. We have very little information about the medieval St David's Church. Its history is very obscure. By the 18th century, when the first illustrations are known, it was a little structure with a square tower and two aisles, as shown in this drawing from the chamber map book, and also a sketch by Thomas Shapter made just before its demolition in around about 1817. The church had been seriously damaged during skirmishes in the 16th century and again in the 17th century, when we believe there was a small fort on Mount Dinham, which was used to protect the mills down below, near the site of the present mill on the X and at the bottom of X Street. This may have been a little sort of star-shaped fortification, a sconce, or a outwork. Nothing is known about it, and it probably lies way to the west of the church under the present Mount Dinham houses. During the later 17th century, of course, in Exeter, the cloth industry absolutely flourished, and Exeter became one of the richest cities in the kingdom. At this period, and possibly also because of the losses that the city had suffered during the skirmishes of the Civil War, the city began to sell off the Duryard Estate into parcels of land, part of which were used for big aristocratic estates and others for industrial activities such as the cloth drying. Now, Mount Dinham, which in those days was known as Culver Park, named after because it was presumably frequented by doves, seems to have been used as a magnificent great rack field, where because the high land was really conducive to drying cloth. And early maps and illustrations sometimes show the racks on Mount Dinham, as we see in Tozer's map of 1798, where you can see that Culver Park is divided into rows and rows and rows of cloth drying racks. These were enormous wooden structures with two bars attached to them, one low down roughly at knee height and another way above head height, so that if you stood and stretched your hands upwards you could just about reach the top bar. These bars were studded with lots of little sort of claw-like metal hooks, so that the cloth could be hung upon the hooks at bottom and the top, and thus it would be secured during its drying. Some modern examples of cloth tentering are shown here. This wonderful image by William Schellings showing the view of Exeter from Exwick in the summer of 1662, just after the civil wars and after the Restoration, show cloth racks on the cliffs at Mount Dinham. They also show, incidentally, the castle and the cathedral in ways we find it hard to see nowadays. So as the Duryard Estate was broken up into larger and larger properties, and many more properties, people developed beautiful houses on them. The rich, of course, built substantial mansions. Often these took the name Duryard. So we see here Little Duryard, which is now Duryard Hall at Exeter University, and Great Duryard, shown here very derelict, but now I believe a Steiner school. There were also several other Duryards, Middle Duryard, and other properties that I can't remember the names of just at the moment. On St. David's Hill, a few really magnificent houses, including the one currently in use for the Institution for the Blind, also survive. This has wonderful interior features, including panelling and staircases. Now, not very well treated by the County Council. But Exeter's prosperity meant, of course, that it wasn't only rich people who moved out to St. David's, but also a large number of more modest families. And so all the way down St. David's Hill, one began to see the development of lots and lots and lots of merchants' housing and also smaller workers' homes. So the lower North Street still retains terraces of magnificent mid-18th century houses dating from the 1760s, just before the North Gate was demolished, which contain fabulous features like this wonderful staircase. Smaller houses in Northern Hay Street and in the little alleys and lanes off St. David's Hill were also developed right the way through into the 19th century, and many of the people living here would have worked in the mills down in X Street, the abattoirs, the dye works, and even the gas works that developed on the Bon Hay and the Shill Hay and in X Island. So the population of the parish massively increased, and of course this led to a considerable pressure on the old parish church, which was still a little medieval building, much rebuilt after its damage in the 17th century wars and the 16th century wars. So by about the beginning of the early 19th century, a new church was demanded. This quite magnificent building in its own way was a big square stucco box with a Greek Doric portico at one end and a tower with a dome that was often likened by people in Exeter to a piece of Georgian silver tableware. So it's called the Pepper Pot. This very beautiful church was designed by James Green, and stood on a different site from the older church, but not very far away from it. And it occupies exactly the site of the present St. David's today. Even this building, though, newly built in 1816 to 17, was not adequate for the needs of the congregation for very long, because by 1835 it had to be extended by a huge new eastern addition. I speak liturgically, as far as I know the church isn't correctly oriented. There's an early photograph of this which shows a large eastern structure with transepts that was added by the architect John Hayward. Alexa, stop! Alexa, stop! In 1835. I apologise for that. In 1835. The interior of the church was congested with high pews, all of which were let out privately. So in order to get to sit down during the church services, you basically had to tip a pew opener and sit in the pew that was allotted to you personally. So this actually was very difficult because it excluded most of the poor of the parish, who were, as I have said, rapidly increasing in number. There were also, as shown from this interior photograph, very, 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 very deep galleries, which really restricted the amount of visible, the amount of light, and although they could accommodate a very large congregation, it wasn't really conducive to very seemly architecture. And here we see that the the Greek revival of the exterior was in fact rather thinly laid on in the inside. This does not really resemble the interior of a Greek temple. Now this lack of provision for the poor in both education and in church provision, among other things, became a national scandal during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And the reform of all these educational and ecclesiastical institutions was led largely by the churches. For example, the reason our schools, many of which are church schools, is because they were actually founded by church organisations, funded by church organisations, in order to make up for the lack of attention to education by the government. The government in England did not really consider providing schools for the poor until the 1870s with the foundation of the board schools. So almost all the initiative for education and church provision initially came from the churches themselves. This was because of an awareness that the modern society seemed to be failing the poor, and a famous polemicist, Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, wrote a very instructive book called Contrasts, which, although perhaps a little unfair, tried to contrast the apparent practice of the Middle Ages, a period when benign paternalism by the upper classes was supposed to improve the lot of the poor, with the practice of the 19th century. And you see here in these illustrations a workhouse on the sort of an octagonal model with a central building from which all the inmates could be constantly viewed, and above we see a hospital of the Middle Ages based upon the great hospital of St. Cross at Winchester. We also see at the bottom right contrasted public fountains, one of which is chained up and with a beadle telling the young man to run away, and another which is beautiful and publicly accessible. So Pugin encouraged people to think about the Middle Ages as a time when people had a social responsibility for each other, when they were kinder to each other, when they saw their duty towards one another regardless of social class. These ideas were not originally his, but he was one of the greatest expounders of these ideas. And so we see a desire on the part of early 19th century people to change the way society interacted with its poorer members. And Mount Dinham is a superb example of this 19th century process. The site was developed basically after centuries as a little used garden, or allotments. It was called California and Turner's Garden. It was basically just wasteland, into a Victorian charitable village. So we will now look at the development of Mount Dinham very quickly in these series of slides. The first institution to move to Mount Dinham was the Institution for the Blind, which occupied 18th century houses on St David's Hill from about 1843, although I think they'd acquired some land as early as 1829. And this, shown in green here, extended from St David's Hill over most of the site of the present school field. In 1860 to 61, the Episcopal schools were moved to the site. This was an 18th century charity school that had been founded by Bishop Offspring Blackall, for both boys and for girls. And it had formerly been in really quite congested premises in Paul Street, as we shall see. So these moved to the site in 1860 to 1861, and their buildings survive to the north of the church. Then from 1861 to 2, the free cottages were constructed in a series of benefactions by various people, but starting with John Dinham, after whom the site is named. The St. Michael's Church arrived in 1864-8, and then more or less contemporary with it, the St. David's School building was constructed east of the church in 1868. Shortly afterwards, a girls' school was provided down in X Street, but unfortunately this no longer survives. The benefactors here for the whole of Mount Dinham are Bishop Offspring Blackall, 1655 to 1716, who founded the Episcopal schools, and also, as Exeter people will probably remember, Bishop Blackall schools, which used to be in Pennsylvania Hill. Both these schools are now united to form Heels, or St. Peter's School. John Dinham, 1788 to 1864, he was a silversmith and tea merchant who, after a bankruptcy and a difficult time, founded the Free Cottagers. And of course William Gibbs, a London merchant of Exeter ancestry, who founded St. Michael's Church and St. David's School. The Episcopal charity schools were founded by Bishop Offspring Blackall in 1709, and they were originally built within small buildings in Paul Street, which now survive as a bar. I can't remember its name, but you can still see one of the small buildings which represents the schoolmaster's house. These are shown in a reconstruction drawing here. The headmaster's house was rebuilt with curved apsidal ends, which in a building which still survives at the corner of Queen Street and Upper Paul Street. This was later masked by a rather wonderful Venetian Gothic style building. But by this time, the congested site in Paul Street was considered so unhealthy that new school buildings were provided. Now, John Dinham was on the board of trustees for the Episcopal schools, and he basically acquired the whole site at Mount Dinham, Turner's Garden or California, whatever it was called at the time, and he constructed on it, or he persuaded the trustees to build wonderful new Tudor style school buildings on this healthy open site. Thus was commenced that noble plan for benefiting both young and old, now so deservedly estimated and so entirely admired, namely the Mount Dinham Charitable Village. So in this slide we see the Episcopal school building with its central block containing the committee rooms, and on either side of it were great big one-storey boys and girls classrooms. These have now been divided into 2 stories, but essentially the structure of the building still survives. On either side, pretty much as it was arranged in Paul Street, you had a small building for the school mistress and a slightly larger house for the schoolmaster. These also survive. The next intervention, also designed by the same architect as the Episcopal schools, who was George Cummings, the city surveyor in the 1860s, were the Free Cottagers. Now these are also in a kind of Tudor or Elizabethan style, with brick construction and stone dressings. They're now being restored by a local housing association. Each block of dwellings seems to contain 4 little houses, 2 on the ground floor. No, they contain 6 little houses, 4 on the ground floor and 2 on the upper story. The first ones were built over towards the north part of the site, forming an avenue not precisely aligned on the new Episcopal school buildings. Then this was followed in 1862 by a further 2 blocks built by John Dinham's friends, and finally by cottages built by Mr. Skeins in 1862. Indeed, Mr. Skeins and his wife retired into these buildings in due course, so they were no mean thing. And finally, the Cottagers and Gardener's House with the committee rooms, that later became, which is now at the main entrance to the site, were built by John Dinham to complete the place. The grounds were beautifully laid out by the famous Exeter landscape gardener John Veitch, and in those days, of course, the grounds were open to the public because they were designed as a sort of a resource for the entire city. The contemporary description of the site says, "Convenient seats are placed in suitable spots where the invalid or casual visitor may enjoy the air and prospect. Here, like a sunbeam in a winter's day, in the midst of beauty and fertility, the aged and infirm may enjoy the repose they so much need." Of course, to complete the site, a large church was needed, this being a Victorian charitable village, and partly this church was designed specifically for the poor, the idea being, of course, that the poor could not get easy access to St David's, which was so dominated by rented pew systems and by the local landed gentry that access to the church service was very difficult. So John Dinham set aside a piece of land for the construction of a new church. But unlike the old St David's, this was going to be an entirely new kind of church. For this we have to thank the 19th century ecclesiological movement. This movement basically began in the later 18th century, and it sought to change the way people designed, used, and saw churches. They wanted, instead of the church being an arm of the state, a sort of, a repressive organisation that basically sort of, in which a big bewigged and gowned parson gave out the law from the pulpit, they wanted the church to be a place of a more free religion where people were able to accommodate their own religious lives in prayer and devotion, as well as also attending revitalised forms of the Anglican liturgy. Now, in order to sort of like signify this fundamental change in attitude, a sort of an attitude which tried to link the church of the mid-19th century and the early 19th century to the historic church, the ancient church, founded in these islands in the late Roman period and revitalised by Augustine and Hilda, Wilfrid, and all the great heroes of early Christian Britain. So the new churches were to be very significantly different from the churches that had been. For a start, they were to be focused more completely upon the altar rather than upon the sermon, and they were to be Gothic in style. This was a deliberate attempt to emphasise a change and a belief in the legitimacy of the Anglican Church as part of historic Christianity. So initially, the government provided some money for new churches in order, we are told, to counter unrest after the Napoleonic Wars and the French and American revolutions. And these were not exactly very inspiring buildings. A good example is the Commissioner's Gothic so-called church at Countess Weir, which basically was a simple box, rather like the old Greek revival St David's, but this time in a Gothic style with pointy windows. But that was about the limit of its Gothicness. Now, round about this time, people also becoming very interested in the roots of the church in and its expression throughout history. They began to demand a more archaeological approach, a more detailed and more careful understanding of genuine medieval buildings in order to develop new forms of church architecture. So the early ecclesiological type of building at Exeter, designed in 1841, shows how the ideal of the church had now changed from a Greek box to a Gothic box, and beyond a Gothic box to a more correctly detailed Gothic box reminiscent of 14th century English architecture, at which time Gothic art was held to be at its most unbelievable and splendid and wonderful development. Later developments, of course, saw a reaction against a kind of picturesqueness of the 14th century and towards a kind of more aggressive, more strident, more urban European Gothic, and we see this in massive and beautiful churches like St. Matthew's in Newtown, where brick Baltic Gothic is used to create a really impressive structure, designed to appeal to the urban working class. Now, the exponents of this ideology, this new Gothic ideology, were the Cambridge Camden Society, who were initially based on, as is obvious, in Cambridge, but who moved after some difficulty to London, where they became the St. Paul's Ecclesiological Society, and which now still survive as the Ecclesiological Society. Locally, we had our own branch, one of the first provincial forms of ecclesiological society in the Exeter Diocesan Architectural Society, which was founded in 1841, so very early on. I think the Northampton Archaeological Society is the only other society founded in the same year, older than ours, in the provinces. So the new type of church, unlike the Georgian church that we see at St. David's, and which still survived at this time, was a magnificent building designed to basically impress and awe the casual visitor by its handsomeness, by its beauty, by its soaring architecture, by its richness of colour, craftsmanship and material. And St. Michael's Church, which was designed by Major Road Hawkins in 1864-8 and built virtually entirely at the expense of William Gibbs, is an example of this. The architecture of the church, you can see, unlike the white stucco of St. David's or the rather crude rubble masonry of St. Luke's in Countess Weir, utilises rich coloured stonework, including blue Wesley stone and golden hamstone for the dressings, and also coloured marbles for the shafts on the main door, and also in parts of the interior. The interior, as well as the exterior, were designed to be very, very tall, so to raise up the building so it could not be missed. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. The interior was designed to have clear sight lines all the way from the west end to the altar. The pulpit and other and reading desk were subsidiary to the altar. The altar was raised up on a great platform, now the chancel, where a robed choir would provide chanting for all the services. But the critical thing about this magnificent building, and all churches at this period really, is that all the pews and benches were absolutely free. So when you arrived as a member of the public, whatever social class you came from, you could sit anywhere you wanted. There were no doors, there were no locks, there was nobody to tell you you can't sit there. Whether this actually worked in practice is another matter, but that was the intention. So the site for the church had been set aside by John Dinham originally for a chapel or church. He had intended to endow the building to provide funds for a separate vicar, and indeed the intention was that this would eventually become a parish church in its own right, separate from St. David's. Unlike every other church in the city, including St. James's, Emmanuel, St. Matthew's, and many others, this never actually happened, and it's hard to know why. But the building is really odd because the original piece of land, which you could have fitted a very substantial church on, was considered to be too small. So they actually had to buy an extra piece of land in order to accommodate a building of a very, very precise size and dimensions. It doesn't even use up the original area of land, which is shown in pink in this slide, but it extends across an additional piece of land bought from the trustees of the blind institution, which is shown in blue. This seems to have been because the proportions and dimensions of the church were absolutely critical. The original architect's drawings show that the church occupied the absolute limits of the possible land in terms of the width, but did not extend the full length. So the buttresses of the north transept had to be omitted to fit this building in. Now, it is, as you can see from the original architectural drawings, extraordinarily impressive structure, with a long nave and very short transepts and chancel, which give the building a sort of rather disproportionate quality. However, in fact, it's all designed on the basis of equilateral triangles. It's very, very carefully and very beautifully measured. The steeple, which is an original feature and one of the rare features of this church, is that it is actually finished. Many Victorian churches started out with the intention of building towers. We see examples here in Exeter, both at Emmanuel and at St. Matthew's, but their towers were never finished. At St. Michael's, the steeple was finished, and it's 230 foot high and a major city landmark. The side view of the church shows how the long nave has short little has stubby little passage aisles running alongside, which is simply to access the benches. This means, of course, that wherever you sat in the church, you could see the altar, and also you can see to the south of the church the choir vestry, where the robed choir, which is at that time a very, very sort of new, novel, and not an uncontroversial addition to Anglican worship, would robe before services. The original building, as we see, was supposed to have a stepped backward front. So at some point during the design process, the major west wall with its great raised window was moved forward by half a bay, making the nave slightly longer and creating a short gallery within the church for a purpose we can't quite determine. Galleries were not approved of by Victorian ecclesiologists, but St. Michael's has one, and one can only assume that they intended it for the accommodation of a small organ, or that, as at present, it would be used for singing during occasional services. You will notice also that there was provision from the very start for a large organ in a recess in the north wall of the chancel. So the organ and the choir were to be closely related from the very beginning. The steeple was to have been decorated with wild beasts. Unfortunately, these were never actually installed, but it is a magnificent structure. It's lost a lot of detail. It's lost nook shafts in the corners of the windows, and many of the sort of finials of the pinnacles have gone missing over the years. Many were removed in 1919, when I think they thought the building wouldn't last much longer. However, essentially, although slightly ruined, it is still one of the church's most impressive features. The west end shows the Victorian idea of structural polychromy, where the richness of the building is actually a form of its actual construction. So the grey stone and the golden yellow stone are deliberately contrasted to bring out the sumptuousness. The craftsmanship is all emphasised. The green marble shafts again provide another note of colour. The whole thing is a reaction against falseness in architecture. The idea that basically you might, in the Georgian period, have built a church out of brick, covered it with stucco, and then divided the stucco with artificial scoring lines to resemble big blocks of stone. Or, for example, you might have erected a west gallery on wooden columns or iron columns and painted these to resemble marble. The Victorians believed this was untrue and not worthy of the temple of God. So they insisted on the that every structure designed for a Victorian church should be true to its material. So if you're building an iron screen or a stone building or a wooden piece of furniture, the structural methods you use should truly reflect that material. With this philosophy, they completely revolutionised the way we make and design things to this day. They had a vast influence. They also believed that the craftsmanship of a building should be transcendently beautiful, and that the artisan working on a building should enjoy his or her craft. If you wish to read Ruskin's Stones of Venice or Seven Lamps of Architecture, particularly the Seven Lamps of Architecture, you will find a great deal about how the Gothic building allows the artisan to really enjoy the process of creating, whereas a classical building in which you basically repeat endless mutules or Corinthian capitals without any creative input of your own is stifling. You may not agree with him, I do. The decorative detail at St. Michael's is once again completely outstanding. Now, this was done by a firm of craftsmen from Taunton, among others. So we see on the west front these fantastic little sort of crouching beasts ready to spring, and the interior of the church, these stunning early French style columns rising above short fat shafts of ham stone, the carving of the upper parts of the soffits of the arches and the mouldings, and the terminals to the drip mouldings over the arches are all in Bath stone, and they are absolutely beautiful. They are considered to be some of the finest stone carving in the county, if not in England. Comparable with the works in the presbytery at Exeter Cathedral, which are stunning, of course, 14th century in date. These, of course, are designed by were made by Harle of Taunton in the 1860s, and they seem to represent the concept of God's beneficence, that basically you have this endless variety of foliage. Of course, you could identify the actual plants if you cared to, and little beasts feeding from them. So you find mice eating flowers, you find strange winged mythical creatures, and you find odd kind of, I don't know, strange lizard horses eating hops and mulberries. It's absolutely marvellous. The other furnishings of the church are also very, very rich. The font was made by a French artist called Jacquet. The western screen, which again is an unusual feature in a Victorian church, supporting the West Gallery, was probably made by Thomas Nichols and is carved with images of St. Michael defeating the devil, and of course angels with their wings stretching out across the building. This appears to be a reference to the temple in the at Jerusalem from the second book of Kings, or something of the kind. Stained glass is made by Warden Hughes of Soho, and we see in the Great Western stained glass window a vision of God, the Alpha and Omega. It's quite brilliant. In the chancel of the church, the foliage carvings at the basis of the shaft supporting the roof seem to be referencing Blessed Virgin Mary by the use of roses and lilies, and Christ by the reference by using passion flowers and vines and grapes and wheat. There's also, most unusually for the 1860s, a freestanding wooden statue of St. Michael defeating the devil, which was originally on the arms box. The idea of a Victorian church of the 1860s being complete with freestanding coloured wooden statuary is quite unusual. for the period. Now, the interior decorations were not just randomly sprayed all over the inside of the building. They conformed to a hierarchy of ornament, the idea being at the west end, where the theme, as I say, is God's beneficence and the way he feeds us freely, which is plainer as you go east towards the holier parts of the church, the so-called holier parts of the church. Everything gets richer and more elaborate. The shafts in the walls turn to marble, and the tiling of the floor gets more and more and more elaborate, culminating in the sanctuary itself with the absolutely magnificent reredos, the sort of decorated wall behind the altar, which shows the 12 apostles and Christ in majesty surrounded by the 4 evangelists, all in mastic and mosaic. And this appears to have developed over a long period of time. Originally the apostles weren't there, and neither was Christ in majesty, because it was very difficult to get away with that kind of imagery in the 1860s and early 1870s, because you were likely to be taken to court by your own fellow Christians. Luckily, after a big battle in Exeter Cathedral over the famous Exeter Reredos case, the idea of imagery in Anglican churches finally became accepted, and so we were able to start enriching the bare framework with more consciously symbolic ornament. Oddly enough, several features at St. Michael's predate this and are really quite amazing. For example, up in the sanctuary there is a 3-seater sedilia. That's the seat for the priest, deacon and subdeacon at High Mass. Now, no Anglican church of the mid-19th century, like St. Michael's, could ever have had a priest, deacon and subdeacon celebrating High Mass. So these were probably provided for the vicar and his curates, but they also seem to me to signify the intention and the direction in which the designers of this church wanted to go, i.e. towards a full revival of Catholic liturgy in the Church of England. The east window, also by Warden Hughes of Soho, is a stunning piece of stained glass, showing visions of angels from the Old and New Testaments. The Old Testament mainly occurring on the bottom layer and the New Testament above, but there's all sorts of dynamic and interesting relationships. For example, the central panel on both the bottom and the lower layer, bottom and the top layer. The top layer shows the resurrection with Christ beaming up into heaven out of the open grave, and below we see Michael beating down the angel beating down the devil into a grim dark hole. So there are wonderful. It's a fine dynamic piece of art and well worth looking at. So these furnishings are both original, but they have been enriched with colour and painting, and indeed the east window. We believe that it was enhanced at some period by additional colour. So it seems that all the reds, or all the greens, or all the blues in the original window were taken out and renewed to make it more vivid. And this is part of a process that basically Victorian churches were built not only as kind of like, not just to be finished as they stood, but also to allow a process of continual enrichment. The original interior of St. Michael's, as is shown in this early photograph dated from 1870, looks quite plain, but the likelihood is that it was all going to be decorated with paintings and with additional furnishings. So among these, we see the fabulous pulpit designed by Sir Arthur William Blomfield, which dates from the late 1870s. We see the new the painting of the chancel roof, which dates from the early 1880s, and originally the decoration of the chancel walls with a wonderful and exquisite pattern of vine leaves and other decorations, which was built as a memorial to William Gibbs after his death in the early 1880s. Another outstanding feature of the church, and one of the most beautiful and tender pieces of 19th century memorial sculpture I know of, is the effigy of William Gibbs, designed by H. Armstead in the chancel. Armstead was one of the leading Victorian sculptors. His work surrounds the Albert Memorial in Hyde Park, so this is top-notch stuff. So the idea was that you built a church as a vessel which you could then enrich with your own through your own piety. This very much on the medieval model. So at St. Michael's, a perhaps less happy edition of the 1950s was the richly coloured carved high altar. You can see in another church at Torquay, St Mary Magdalene's at Upton, the contrast between the nave of the church, which remains basically in its plain and original unadorned state, and the chancel, where some absolutely rocket-like and completely amazing Victorian furnishings were added as the century progressed. So the church was it was designed as a blank canvas which the piety of the people could enrich and enrobe in splendour. From the very beginning, St Michael's had a magnificent choral tradition. It also used a great deal of plain chant. This was not uncontroversial, and indeed the newspapers are full of letters complaining about sort of unorthodox practices at St Michael's in the early days. However, the provision of robed choirs and also teams of servers enabled the church to open its activities to a wider range of people. So basically, ordinary working class people from X Street or North Street or Northern A Street could aspire to basically singing in the choir. They would learn the best music. They would they might attend one of the charity schools, St David's School or the Episcopal School, and they could basically be fully engaged in the life of the church, serving in its physical worship. The increasing elaboration of church services also enabled teams of servers to be built up, again, to participate fully in the in all the forms of worship available at the time. Now, although choir and serving roles during this period were mainly reserved for men and boys, there were many other activities that that Victorian Anglo-Catholic clergy introduced, including huge numbers of charitable activities, and they also, which meant that everybody, male or female, could be involved. Now, of course, they were male and female roles that we might disapprove of nowadays, but for example, the need for rich vestments meant that women were fully involved in embroidery. They were fully involved in all sorts of charitable activities. So the whole congregation could take part in the life of the church in a way that it had not been possible during the Georgian period, when basically the entire service was directed by the vicar and the clerk from the pulpit. There are also signs at St Michael's of interesting developments in a much more overtly Roman Catholic direction, including a gradines and a tabernacle on the present Lady altar, which date from 1895. But in 1895, nobody could possibly have expected to reserve the sacrament on an altar, even a side altar. So why there should be a tabernacle in the middle of the gradines is hard to tell. The high altar itself was given folding riddles. Luckily, these have gone. And gradually, things like incense and all other sort of and much richer liturgies such as benediction were introduced and are used at St. Michael's. Both survive today. This outstanding revival of church life really changed the way people interact with religion. In the sort of early 20th century, vast numbers of people went to their churches. The Methodist and Baptist and other churches also revitalised themselves in a similar way. So many of the hymns that we now sing, whichever church we go to, or indeed if we don't go to any church at all, were written in the 19th century for use in Methodist, Anglican, or other churches, and they became enormously popular, and people really were engaged with their religion. It is a tragedy that this has not been sustained, and in fact so much of the legacy, Victorian legacy of now is disregarded, and as a result many rich and sumptuous buildings are under threat. Here we see All Saints Harle Street, Plymouth, which was a truly stunning urban Anglo-Catholic church. Unfortunately, it was demolished in the 1980s, largely due to storm damage. And St. Michael's little sister, the Church of St. Anthony at Cowley, which has been closed for worship recently. The Victorians really believed that the church's duty was to reach out to people, and this is what they did, and they achieved it. We seem to have taken a less proactive approach, and the results are unfortunate. St. Michael's, of course, went through its own very dark times during the 1970s and 1980s, when for a long time the building was regarded as a white elephant which should really be closed as part of a rationalisation of the church. Luckily, St. Michael's has not succumbed to this. For a long time now, for more than 20 years, St. Michael's has tried to revitalise itself by a large, magnificent choir. We also have this has been, I think, a great success. The choir are highly regarded locally, and it has involved, connections with the university and with local people, as well as, just your casual visitor. So the choir tradition remains, and indeed has gone from strength to strength in recent years. We've also, in order to support this, have managed to acquire a magnificent new organ. This originally came from a church in Birmingham, St Jude's in Tonk Street, which was unfortunately demolished in the 1970s. The organ then went on a sort of sad peregrination, ending in a Dorset public school, which recently replaced it with an electrical organ. And St Michael's was able to acquire it and install it, and it is well used for practice by local organists, and it supports our liturgy magnificently. The organ project was funded by local benefactors as well as by the Heritage Lottery Fund, and it was a truly extraordinary process to see the organ going in to replace an electronic instrument which had been put in after the original Victorian instrument was damaged by water in the 1950s. So part of the church, which had for a long time just been a derelict, empty and aching void, has now been filled with a new instrument, as a sign of wonderful new life and confidence in the future of St Michael's. We are also fortunate enough to be host to a family of Peregrine Falcons, although I believe this year they did not succeed in breeding. But they've occupied the Steeple since 1987. They started breeding in 1997, and they are regarded as, I think, one of the first urban peregrine nests. Many other cathedrals have now jumped on the bandwagon and have their own peregrines, but ours were the first and the best, quite obviously. In terms of future projects, these are only marginally more insane than the ones that have gone before. It has been suggested that we might hang a magnificent great rood reclaimed from All Saints Harle Street in Plymouth as a memorial to the great Anglo-Catholics and also to the great Anglo-Catholic tradition of the parish. Here, the rood, which is designed by a Plymouth architect called Kitzel and built by one of the great 19th and early 20th century church furnishers, James B. Hunt of Plymouth, might look, if it were hung at St. Michael's in the chancel arch. We hope that St. Michael's will survive many more centuries and that it will be an inspiration to many others. We do not intend, as here, to add an extra 2 stories to our steeple, but you never know. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye. Hello, my name is Richard Parker. I'm here to talk about the history of Mount Dinham and St. Michael's Church